Listening for JETPIG. I put this title out there and I see some people chuckling just hearing that. And I've had a bunch of people said, "What is JETPIG?" Well, maybe you don't recall, but I talked about it in the month ago. And here's JETPIG. It's our little character here on the left side of your screen, our little friend, the pig, wearing his aviator goggles, flying through outer space. And the important thing is to look at his back. He's got little jet packs that help propel him forward, and they have hearts on them, meaning they're filled with love. So it's love propelling this flying pig forward. And it's all about our shared Unitarian Universalist values, which we've been talking about all year long. And I talked about when we were doing the camp Sunday in September. So if you line them up in a certain order, justice, equity, transformation, pluralism, interdependence, and generosity, they spell JETPIG. And it just as a reminder, this came from an RE teacher somewhere that was trying to teach their children to remember our values and came up with this idea. So there you have it. That's what JETPIG is. I'm going to leave this slide up because first it's entertaining, but also I'm going to keep referring to it. So last week I was here and I talked about metaphor. And I talked about using metaphor as a portal to really think about what's at the center of your heart. Because a lot of what we've been talking about, all these shared Unitarian Universalist values, circle around love-centered lives. So I had two questions for you. First, is love at the center of your core? Maybe it's there. I think you're all loving people. I believe it's there. Does it share space with something else, which makes us a little conflicted? Or is love really the center of how you make decisions, how you approach life? And then how do you connect to the JETPIG? How do you connect to the Unitarian Universalist values? Does that make sense to you? So I hope you did your homework and thought about that, because this week I'm going to focus on the outside world, listening to those outside of us and listening deeply for our values and how they show up or don't show up in the rest of the world. I'm going to lean in heavily to Alpau's quote, talking about thin versus thick stories and the values behind them. I love the idea of narrative therapy. I don't know that I've actually heard that name. I've heard the concept, but it makes a lot of sense. If you recall my first metaphor last week, it was when I was, well, my whole childhood and teen years, growing up in a very fundamentalist Christian home, the metaphor was that traditional God figure. And all the values in my core were exactly the same as the values that all my elders had told me should be there. And my job was to keep them in sync with each other. So that was probably more of a thin narrative, because it took me later, when I finally had the freedom to reflect on my own values, that I came up with thick stories. So again, thin stories are handed down to us, and they're kind of believed without critical thinking or experience. That's more or less the expectation. Whereas thick stories develop directly from our core and the connected values in our life experiences. So I'm going to give you an example, my way of perceiving how this works, going through all of these values. But this week, as I was preparing for this message, I had an aha moment, because instead of JETPIG, I actually like GIPTEDGE, which of course makes no sense whatsoever, and you won't remember it. But I realized that if you do them in opposite order, it made sense for what I wanted to talk about today. So it talks about sort of an overall overarching way of approaching the world, and then it kind of keeps drilling down into more and more specific values. And that's why it made sense to me. So bear with me. Here's how it works. If love is the center of our lives, then generosity, which is the one on the bottom, this would be our story. We love this world and believe it has a bright future eventually. Now, a lot of us might be quite concerned over the next couple of weeks and maybe the next 4 or 5 years. But I think eventually we are an optimistic people. We start our lives with hope and with a future that we think looks brighter. We often use the phrase, we gather together, we do this work to help build a better future. Well, that's an audacious hope, as we talked about it from our chalice lighting, that we actually can sit here and say, you know what, I don't care what's going on in the world. I believe we can build a better world. It's all about human development, that we become better than we were in the past. And for me, this was very much grounded in a reading I did, a super thick book in seminary. Some of you maybe have read it, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined by Steven Pinker. It came out in 2011. And to me, this is one of those thick stories. It was over the top researched, and he had each chapter would talk about how in the last 1,000 years violence is down, either societies warring with each other or people against each other, that kind of thing. It was quite convincing, and he had examples from all over the globe. And so that's the kind of thing I think that grounds me. I had that feeling before I read that book, but it made me realize that over time, society in the world and people in the world and our living standard in many places has just gotten better. So it seems to be the case for optimism and hope. Of course, this human development is always uneven in different places in the globe. And just right here in the US, technology, medical science, our phones, computers, I mean, it's going at light speed, but the human development is still at the slowest pace it's ever been. So some would argue that humans haven't developed as fast as our technology has. And the biggest problem of all, of course, is living sustainably and figuring out how to solve that problem that we can live on this planet. So that's my way of approaching generosity. It's not just how much money you give, how much time you give, how much you give of your talents, but a generosity of spirit towards the world. The opposite thin story, then, is what you've been told by a lot of the media continuously over and over and over again. And it's all centered in fear and cynicism. A message that everyone in the world is out to get you. The world is an evil, dangerous place and is frankly just stacked against you. So you better hunker down and get ready to fight. Probably the most extreme example of this are those who look at what's going on in the Middle East right now and are actually in favor of an all-out war that might end the world because that would bring in the rapture, because they believe that the second coming would happen, they would still survive and be entering into a new world. That's how dangerous that can be. So the next value, moving up the ladder, is interdependence. Our story is that everything in this world is connected. All peoples and societies, and everything in the environment, of which obviously the peoples and societies are a part. No one is truly independent and can disregard the impact or consequences of their actions. And we see this most strongly in the environmental movement, and I'd say in our foreign policies, because over time, particularly in the 20th century, we learned that just growth without paying any attention to what's going on in the environment is a really bad thing, and you have to fix it if you can fix it. And now it's led to global warming. Our foreign policies after World War II was the first time that many nations came together to unite to try to keep the world peaceful. So our thick narrative then is we have learned that a recognition of our interdependence ultimately delivers the best results for society. The opposite story, of course, is absolute insistence on independence. It's a deep cultural trait so prevalent in the American psyche. It's frankly a frontier mentality that we haven't lost over 300 years. We are the lone cowboy up against the hostile environment out there. And to our detriment, it's a firm belief in this dichotomy, false dichotomy of humans versus the environment. The thin narrative is naive at best and extremely selfish and dangerous at its worst. Such an insistence has obviously led to overuse of resources and global warming, as well as other environmental catastrophes. Pluralism, our thick story. From experience, We frankly just know that diversity is cool and a strength. And the example that comes to mind over and over, and I know it's shallow and simple, but it's so obvious. The gifts of cultural diversity are unmeasurable in our society. Think of the variety, and I'm looking in my lifetime when I was a little kid to now, the variety of food, of art, of music, of culture, and it goes on and on and on, that we have been so blessed because our culture has become more and more and more diverse. The opposite thin story, we're told that anyone not like us is suspicious and unwelcome here. The other is to be feared, ridiculed, and terrorized via conspiracy theories and lies. Transformation. Our thick story is always moving forward to this idealistic future for everyone. I'm going to go back to that The Better Angels of Our Nature book that I read, that over a 1,000-year period, things seem to be getting better slowly but surely. We seem to have that as a basis of our belief. As opposed to the thin story where there's this yearning to go backward to this idealistic past for a favored few. It's a made-up narrative, a fairy tale. The fact is, if you think about it, that past that they usually point to was a rigid society, which many people at the time, frankly, wanted to escape. Remember the counterculture revolution of the 1960s and 70s? There was a reason that existed. Equity, our story. We strive to transform our world where all can thrive sustainably, regardless of your fate in life. It's a way of thinking of the value that it's all about getting everyone across that goal line. It's in this case, the destination, not necessarily what we're doing in between, because that can vary for every situation. The best example I have of this is the creation and expansion of the white middle class after World War II. Frankly, I think it was seen as a payback to the white male veterans for their sacrifices given in the years of earnings that were taken away from them by the war. So they had all kinds of programs that they could make use of to launch into the middle class, and it worked. The opposite story, it worked for them, not everyone. I want to be clear. The opposite story is this whole weird dichotomy between equity, which is our value, and equality, which sounds like it's the same thing, but it's not. So equality is all about treating everyone equally, regardless of their established principles, privilege, or struggles. So this use of the term equality, and the way it's come to be used now, is deeply grounded in suspicion and fear that someone else, or usually a specific group of people, is getting more than they deserve and therefore shorting you. It's a system based on scarcity or on efficiency, but not fairness. So the example is always the pie. In this case, we'd cut the pie, which the pie has a boundary. It's the pan, so there's only so much to go around, and therefore, if you're going to do a program, everybody gets an equal piece of the pie, regardless of if you're a billionaire or if you're barely getting by. That's equality in that sense, and very much our value is specifically equity that says everybody should have a piece of pie. And by the way, if they do, we probably can make bigger pies and have enough to go around. And so it's about that goal. And then finally, justice. Our story is grounded in universal love, the inherent worthiness of everyone. This thick narrative tells us societies work best when they are fair. And I'm not even going to go into examples because I know you probably have a million examples in your head that you can tell yourself. And the opposite thin story is that justice is seen through a lens of a very specific clan's perspective. Justice is only supposed to apply to those that are like ourselves. There's been a lot of written and discussed, and I'll just reiterate it here, that the founding of our nation was unjust. Essentially, only white, primarily landowning men were given true power. Justice for all, which is touted around a lot and a big famous claim, comes from the idea in Europe where only those favored by the ruling sovereign actually had justice. So justice for all here referred to the founding of a democracy in which all white landowning men could vote, hold office, and were treated equally under the law. It's the core cultural idea of white male privilege that still exists. So I want to refer you back to the other reading now by Gareth Gwynne. She says, once we reckon with the paradox of how the perceived other is both distinct and a direct reflection of us, then we see ourselves in that mirror. We see everyone and everything as reflecting an aspect of ourselves that we get to reclaim. Those we might have judged become guideposts for our own liberation. Our triggers, we have a lot of them these days, become welcomed signs that we have rejected something inside us. The idea that you are either with us or against us is a limiting lens that perpetuates humanity's suffering. The recognition that you are us, that everyone is us, allows our self-love to humanize others into belonging. It's a beautiful little piece, and there's a lot in there, which I'm not going to spend the time to unpack. We'd be here another hour. But I do want to say this. As we continue to engage with others right now, who have vastly different opinions and worldviews, I invite you to consider the exercise on our JETPIG values we just went through. What is the story? What's your thick story that ties to that value? And then consider Gwynne's words. When we encounter opposing narratives, we are triggered because we have used our values as a measuring stick, and that narrative comes up short. It doesn't mean that the person should be rejected or ridiculed. Rather, we need to recognize that they are us, just with a different narrative. Keep in mind that often we are hearing thin narratives when they speak passionately about politics. Many have no lived experience or can't point to historical facts to justify these fears and cynic stories. It's simply an outcome of a lack of a generous spirit. I'll start there, towards the world. They enter the world afraid, and it leads to all these thin stories being believed. It's the outcome of a fear-based narrative that starts it all. So I have a suggestion. Think about this for the next coming weeks. Let them speak. Like in the story, the bear has a problem. Let them speak without getting agitated or interrupting them. Don't argue about the merits of the thin narrative. Rather, inquire about their deep value that leads them to this story or opinion, just like we've spent the time understanding our thick stories that go with our values. Then, after you've asked that, then simply end the conversation with your value and your one thick narrative that is how you got to that value. Then move on, either the conversation or physically if you need to. You will leave them thinking about that conversation for a long time. And hold tightly to Gwynne's words. The idea that you are either with us or against us is a limiting lens that perpetuates humanity's suffering, and we do not want to do that. We are Unitarian Universalists, and we are uniquely called to do this kind of deep listening. We can do this hard thing. Amen. Let's take a moment of quiet.